In a small, peaceful town where life moved at its own unhurried pace, there lived a man named John Miller. He was an ordinary man in many ways, kind, hardworking, and always ready to lend a hand when needed. At 68 years old, John had spent most of his life fixing things. As a retired electrician, he had spent decades wiring homes, repairing appliances, and solving problems that others found too complicated or tedious. His hands were calloused from years of work, but they carried a magic touch that could bring even the oldest gadgets back to life. John lived alone in a modest house with a garden that he loved dearly. Every morning, without fail, he would wake up early to tend to his plants. The smell of fresh soil and blooming flowers brought him immense joy. After finishing his gardening chores, he'd sit on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee watching the world go by. It was during these quiet moments that John felt truly content. Life after retirement wasn't glamorous, but it was simple, predictable, and fulfilling in its own way. People in the neighborhood adored John. If someone's lights flickered or their washing machine broke down, they knew exactly who to call. Even though he was no longer working full-time, John never turned anyone away. Helping others gave him purpose, and he took pride in being known as the guy who can fix anything. Whether it was rewiring a faulty outlet or teaching kids how to build a birdhouse, John approached every task with patience and care. On one particular sunny afternoon, as John sat sipping his coffee, his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but such calls weren't uncommon. Over the years, people had learned to trust him, and strangers often reached out hoping for help. With a warm smile, John picked up the phone and greeted the caller cheerfully. "Hello," he said, his voice friendly and inviting. The response was unexpected. A frantic voice on the other end blurted out, "Is this Mr. Harrison's office?" John frowned, confused. "No, you've got the wrong number," he replied. Before he could ask who Mr. Harrison was or why they were so agitated, the line went dead. The abruptness of the call left John scratching his head. Who was this Mr. Harrison, and why did the caller sound so panicked? For a moment, John considered calling the number back to clarify the misunderstanding. But then he shrugged it off, thinking it was probably just another misdial. These things happened all the time, didn't they? Besides, he had more pressing matters to attend to, like trimming the overgrown rose bushes in his garden. As the day wore on, John returned to his usual routine. He pruned the roses, watered the vegetables, and tinkered with an old radio he'd found at a garage sale. Yet despite his best efforts to focus on the tasks at hand, the mysterious phone call lingered in the back of his mind. There was something about it that felt off. The urgency in the caller's tone, the mention of a name he didn't recognize, it all seemed strange. By evening, curiosity got the better of him. John decided to investigate further, using skills he'd picked up over the years, not just as an electrician but also as someone who liked figuring things out. He began tracing the unknown number. He started with basic online searches, typing fragments of the digits into search engines to see if anything came up. To his surprise, he stumbled upon a link to a news article featuring none other than Richard Harrison, a billionaire tech mogul whose face was plastered across magazines and television screens worldwide. Richard Harrison was famous, or infamous depending on whom you asked, for revolutionizing artificial intelligence. His cutting-edge innovations had transformed industries, earned him billions, and made him one of the wealthiest men alive. But fame came with risks, and Richard's life was far from ordinary. Security guards shadowed his every move. Cameras monitored his surroundings 24/7, and rumors swirled about threats from jealous rivals or disgruntled employees. John stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Could the panicked caller have been trying to reach this Richard Harrison? And if so, what kind of trouble was the billionaire in? John felt a mix of excitement and unease. On one hand, he told himself it was none of his business. He was just a retired electrician living a quiet life. On the other hand, something inside him, the same instinct that told him not to ignore a loose wire, urged him to dig deeper. Over the next few hours, John pieced together more information. He discovered that Richard Harrison's company headquarters used the exact number that had accidentally called him earlier. This revelation sent chills down his spine. What were the odds? Was it really just a coincidence, or was there something bigger at play? Unable to shake the feeling that he might be onto something important, John resolved to act. The next morning he dialed the main line of Richard Harrison's corporation, hoping someone would take him seriously. When he finally spoke to Richard himself, John couldn't believe his luck, or perhaps it was fate. Whatever it was, he knew one thing for certain. His quiet, predictable life was about to change forever. Unbeknownst to John, that single mistaken phone call would set off a chain of events that would lead him straight into the heart of danger. Little did he know, his knack for problem-solving and his unassuming nature would soon make him an unlikely hero in a story far greater than anything he could have imagined. While John Miller sat on his porch trying to make sense of the strange phone call, miles away in a gleaming skyscraper that towered over the city, Richard Harrison was preparing for another day of high-stakes decision-making. Richard wasn't just any businessman. He was a visionary who had changed the world with his groundbreaking work in artificial intelligence. His innovations powered industries, saved lives, and reshaped how people lived their daily lives. But fame came at a cost, and Richard's success had made him both admired and envied. Richard's penthouse office was a masterpiece of modern design, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the bustling metropolis. Below, yet despite the luxury surrounding him, Richard often felt like a prisoner in his own life. Security guards stationed outside his door, encrypted communication systems, and bulletproof glass were all reminders of the constant danger lurking in the shadows. For someone as wealthy and influential as Richard, paranoia wasn't just a habit, it was a necessity. That afternoon, however, something unusual happened, shaking even Richard's carefully controlled world. His assistant, Sarah, burst into his office without knocking, a rare breach of protocol. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a tablet. "Mr. Harrison," she stammered, "we have a problem." Richard raised an eyebrow, but didn't look up from the document he was reviewing. "What is it now?" he asked coolly, though his tone betrayed a hint of irritation. He was used to crises, big and small, and had developed a thick skin over the years. Sarah hesitated before speaking. "Someone hacked into your private communication system. They left messages." She handed him the tablet, her fingers brushing against his briefly, as if seeking reassurance. Richard glanced at the screen and immediately stiffened. The messages were cryptic yet chilling. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? I know when you'll die. And I'll be watching." Richard stared at the words, his mind racing. At first glance, they seemed like the ramblings of some deranged fan or disgruntled employee looking for attention. But there was something about the phrasing, calculated, cold, that sent a shiver down his spine. Whoever this person was, they weren't bluffing. "Have the security team traced the source?" Richard demanded sharply, setting the tablet down on his desk. Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. Whoever did this covered their tracks well. It's like they vanished into thin air." Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He prided himself on being one step ahead of everyone else, but this felt different. This felt personal. Over the years, he'd faced lawsuits, angry investors, and even death threats, but nothing quite like this. The hacker hadn't just broken into his system. They had invaded his sanctuary, violated his privacy, and planted seeds of doubt in his mind. Determined not to show weakness, Richard ordered his cybersecurity team to double their efforts. He also instructed them to review every inch of surveillance footage from the past week, searching for anything out of the ordinary. If someone was targeting him, he wanted to know who, why, and most importantly, how far they were willing to go. As the hours passed, Richard grew increasingly restless. He couldn't concentrate on work no matter how hard he tried. Every sound, the hum of the air conditioner, the click of Sarah's heels on the marble floor, made him jump. Even the view outside his window, which usually calmed him, now seemed menacing. Was someone watching him right now? Could they see through the glass? To distract himself, Richard decided to take a walk around his estate. Guarded by tall iron gates and surrounded by lush greenery, the property was supposed to be impenetrable. But tonight, it felt more like a gilded cage than a fortress. As he strolled along the manicured pathways, accompanied by two burly bodyguards, Richard noticed something strange near the perimeter fence. A drone hovered silently in the distance, its blinking lights barely visible in the fading sunlight. "Do we use drones for security patrols?" Richard asked one of the guards. The man frowned. "No, sir. We rely on cameras and foot patrols. That shouldn't be here." Richard's stomach churned. Without saying another word, he turned on his heel and headed back inside. Once in the safety of his office, he called Sarah and ordered her to contact the authorities. Something was definitely wrong and he needed answers. Fast. Later that night, as Richard reviewed the day's events, his thoughts kept drifting back to the mysterious messages. Who could hate him so much? Was it a rival tech company trying to sabotage his empire? An ex-employee seeking revenge? Or was it something more sinister? A criminal mastermind bent on destruction? Despite the overwhelming sense of dread, Richard refused to let fear consume him. He was a fighter, a survivor. Whatever challenge lay ahead, he would face it head-on. Little did he know, help was already on the way, from an unlikely source. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, John Miller was making plans of his own. After tracing the mysterious phone number to Richard Harrison's company, John realized he couldn't ignore what might be a matter of life and death. Though he didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation, his instincts told him to act. With determination burning in his chest, John picked up the phone and dialed the main line of Richard's corporation once again. When Richard finally answered the call, skepticism tinged his voice. "Who is this?" he asked curtly. "It's John Miller," came the reply. "I'm just a retired electrician, but I think I might have information that could help you." At first, Richard dismissed the idea. What could an elderly man living in a quiet suburb possibly know about cyber threats or assassination plots? But as John explained the details of the misdial and shared his concerns, Richard began to listen more closely. There was something genuine about John's tone, earnest, humble, and devoid of ulterior motives. By the end of the conversation, Richard found himself intrigued. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but given the circumstances, he couldn't afford to dismiss it outright. Besides, desperation had a way of making people open to unconventional solutions. As the two men agreed to collaborate, neither of them realized the enormity of the task ahead. They were worlds apart in terms of wealth, status, and experience, yet bound together by a shared goal: survival. Together, they would uncover truths that neither could have imagined alone, and perhaps save not only Richard's life, but countless others as well. For now, though, Richard focused on the immediate threat looming over him. Somewhere out there, a shadowy figure was plotting his demise. And though he didn't know it yet, the key to unraveling the mystery lay in the hands of a man whose greatest achievement until now had been fixing broken toasters. The next morning, John Miller woke up earlier than usual. The events of the previous day, the mysterious phone call, his investigation into Richard Harrison's company, and the conversation with the billionaire himself, had left him restless. As he sat on his porch sipping coffee, he couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was unfolding, and somehow he was part of it. It wasn't every day that a retired electrician from a sleepy suburb found himself entangled in the affairs of one of the world's most powerful men. John didn't consider himself extraordinary. He had spent decades fixing wiring problems, replacing blown fuses and troubleshooting faulty appliances. His life revolved around practical solutions and hands-on work. But this situation was different. For once, the problem wasn't a broken circuit or a malfunctioning gadget. It was human lives at stake. And while John wasn't sure how much help he could offer, he knew one thing for certain: doing nothing wasn't an option. As promised, John called Richard Harrison's office again to follow up. This time, Sarah, Richard's assistant, answered the phone. She sounded calmer but still tense. After confirming John's identity, she connected him directly to Richard. When Richard's deep, authoritative voice came through the line, John felt a mix of nervousness and determination. "Mr. Harrison," John began, his tone polite but firm, "I've been thinking about our conversation last night. I might not be an expert in cybersecurity, but I've dealt with enough electronics over the years to recognize patterns. If you're willing to share more details, maybe I can spot something useful." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Richard seemed hesitant, weighing whether to trust this stranger who claimed to have insights. Finally, he replied, "All right, Mr. Miller. Let's hear what you've got." Over the course of the next hour, John walked Richard through his observations. He explained how the misdial could have been intentional, a way for someone to test vulnerabilities in the communication system. He also pointed out that whoever hacked into Richard's private network must have had access to advanced technology, suggesting they weren't amateurs. Most importantly, John emphasized the importance of looking beyond digital defenses. Sometimes the weakest link in any security system wasn't software but hardware, the physical devices that could be tampered with. Richard listened intently, impressed by John's logical approach. Though John lacked formal training in tech, security, his experience as an electrician gave him a unique perspective. He saw connections others might overlook, because he understood how systems worked from the ground up. By the end of their discussion, Richard decided to bring John into the fold, inviting him to collaborate further. Later that day, John arrived at Richard's sprawling estate, a place so grand it looked like it belonged in a movie. As he stepped out of his old sedan, he felt completely out of place among the luxury cars parked nearby. Dressed in faded jeans and a plaid shirt, John stood out like a sore thumb amidst the polished surroundings. But his discomfort quickly faded when Richard greeted him warmly. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Miller," Richard said, extending his hand. "I won't lie, we're in uncharted territory here, and your input could make all the difference." John nodded, shaking Richard's hand firmly. "Just call me John, and don't worry, I'll do whatever I can to help." Inside the mansion, John was introduced to Richard's team of cybersecurity experts. They were young, sharp, and armed with cutting-edge tools designed to thwart even the most sophisticated attacks. At first glance, John felt intimidated. These were people who spoke in acronyms and jargon he barely understood. But instead of shrinking back, John leaned into his strengths. He asked questions, listened carefully, and offered suggestions based on his years of practical experience. As the group reviewed surveillance footage and analyzed data logs, John noticed something peculiar. One of the cameras near the mansion's power grid showed brief flickers during the past week, moments where the feed went dark for a split second before returning to normal. To everyone else, these glitches seemed insignificant, but John recognized them immediately. "That's not random interference," John said, pointing to the screen. "Someone's tampering with the wiring. Those flickers are signs of deliberate manipulation." The room fell silent as everyone processed his words. Richard turned to John, his expression serious. "Are you saying someone is targeting the power grid?" John nodded. "It makes sense. If they wanted to disable your security systems, they'd start by cutting off the electricity. Once the cameras and alarms go down, they'd have free rein to move in unnoticed." Richard's face hardened. "We need to check the grid right away." Under John's guidance, the team conducted a thorough inspection of the power grid. True to John's prediction, they discovered evidence of tampering. Hidden behind a cluster of bushes near the mansion's perimeter fence was a small device attached to the main electrical line. At first glance, it looked harmless, a black box no bigger than a shoebox, but closer examination revealed its true purpose. It was a remote-controlled disruptor capable of shutting down the entire estate's power supply with the push of a button. "This is bad," one of the technicians muttered, examining the device. "If this goes off, we'll lose everything. Lights, cameras, gates, everything." John knelt beside the technician, studying the mechanism. "Can you disable it remotely?" he asked. The technician shook his head. "Not without triggering it. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. We'd need to dismantle it manually." Richard glanced at John, his eyes filled with urgency. "Can you handle it?" John hesitated for a moment. Handling live wires and tampered equipment was risky business, especially under pressure. But he reminded himself why he was there: to prevent harm and protect innocent lives. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. "I'll do my best." With the team standing by, John carefully opened the device, revealing a tangle of wires and circuits. His hands moved steadily despite the tension in the air. Over the years, he had learned to stay calm under pressure, focusing on the task at hand rather than the potential consequences. Slowly but surely, he identified the critical components and began isolating them. Minutes passed like hours as John worked. Every movement counted, every decision mattered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he disconnected the last wire. The device was neutralized. A collective sigh of relief swept through the group. Richard clapped John on the shoulder, gratitude shining in his eyes. "You saved us," he said simply, but John shook his head. "Not yet. This is just one piece of the puzzle. Whoever planted this will try again. We need to stay vigilant." Back inside the mansion, the team regrouped to strategize their next steps. Using the information gathered from the tampered device, they traced signals leading to a series of drones programmed to breach the estate's defenses. These drones weren't ordinary delivery vehicles. They were weapons disguised as harmless machines equipped with explosives and designed to evade detection. The revelation sent a chill through everyone in the room. They were dealing with a highly organized operation, one that required both technical expertise and ruthless precision. Yet despite the mounting danger, John remained resolute. He may have been an outsider, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. That evening, as John prepared to leave the estate, Richard approached him. "Stay," he said. "We need you here. Whatever happens next, your instincts are invaluable." John hesitated. Staying meant stepping further into a world of uncertainty and peril. But deep down, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when lives depended on his contribution. "I'll stay," John replied quietly, "for as long as it takes." And with those words, an unlikely alliance solidified. A billionaire and a retired electrician, worlds apart yet united by a shared mission, prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together they would uncover truths, confront dangers, and fight to protect not only Richard's life but the lives of countless others caught in the crossfire. Though neither man realized it yet, their journey was far from over. Danger loomed, closer than ever, and the clock was ticking. But for now they had each other, and that was enough to keep hope alive. The days that followed were a blur of activity for John Miller and Richard Harrison. The discovery of the tampered power grid device and the existence of weaponized drones had shifted their focus from cautious investigation to frantic preparation. Every moment counted, and both men knew it. While Richard's team worked tirelessly to fortify the estate's defenses, John continued to apply his practical expertise to identify weak points in the system. Together they formed an unlikely but effective partnership, one driven by desperation, determination, and trust. As the hours ticked away, tension hung heavy in the air. The mansion, once a symbol of luxury and safety, now felt like a fortress, under siege. Security guards patrolled the grounds around the clock, their eyes scanning every shadow. Surveillance cameras monitored every inch of the property, feeding live footage to screens inside the control room. Yet, despite all these precautions, an unsettling question lingered in everyone's minds. How would the attacker strike? And when? John spent most of his time in the basement control room, surrounded by blinking lights, humming servers, and stacks of technical equipment. For someone who had spent decades fixing household appliances, this high-tech environment was overwhelming at first. But John adapted quickly, relying on his instincts and years of hands-on experience to navigate the chaos. He didn't pretend to understand everything the cybersecurity experts discussed, but he listened intently, picking up bits of information that helped him piece together the bigger picture. One evening, as the team reviewed drone schematics, John noticed something peculiar about the device's design. Unlike traditional drones, which were powered entirely by software, these machines had a secondary backup system, a physical override switch located near the engine compartment. This feature seemed unnecessary, almost redundant, given the advanced technology already embedded in the drones. But to John, it stood out as a potential vulnerability. Why would they include a manual override? John asked aloud, pointing to the diagram. It doesn't make sense unless... He trailed off, his brow furrowing as he connected the dots. Richard leaned forward, intrigued. Unless what? Unless they're planning to use it against us, John replied grimly. If the drones are detected before they reach their target, the attackers could trigger the override remotely. That would disable any digital countermeasures we try to deploy. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. If John was right, then disabling the drones wouldn't be enough. They'd need to physically intercept and neutralize them before they breached the estate's perimeter. Richard immediately ordered his security team to set up additional checkpoints and install motion sensors along the property's fence line. Meanwhile, John devised a plan to create decoy signals designed to lure the drones into a trap. Using spare parts and tools scavenged from the mansion's maintenance shed, he built a makeshift jamming device capable of disrupting the drone's GPS systems. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. By the third night, exhaustion had taken its toll on everyone. Richard looked pale and haggard, dark circles forming under his eyes. Even Sarah, his usually composed assistant, seemed frazzled, her clipboard clutched tightly in trembling hands. As for John, his body ached from hours of bending over wires and soldering circuits, but his mind remained sharp. He refused to let fatigue cloud his judgment, not when so much was at stake. Just after midnight, the unthinkable happened. Alarms blared throughout the estate, jolting everyone awake. Red warning lights flashed in the control room as panicked voices crackled over the intercom. "Drone breach confirmed," shouted one of the technicians. "Sector B7, southeast. Corner." Without hesitation, Richard sprang into action, barking orders to his team. Guards rushed to their posts, weapons drawn, while others scrambled to activate emergency protocols. In the chaos, John grabbed his toolbox and headed outside, determined to face the threat head-on. The cool night air hit him like a slap as he stepped onto the lawn. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Years of troubleshooting had taught him that panic only made things worse. Focusing on the task ahead, he scanned the area until he spotted movement near the edge of the property. A sleek black drone hovered silently, its rotors whirring softly as it approached the mansion. "This is it," John muttered under his breath. Clutching his jamming device, he crouched behind a row of bushes, waiting for the perfect moment to act. When the drone came within range, he pressed the button on the device, sending out a burst of electromagnetic interference. The drone faltered mid-air, its navigation system disrupted. Seizing the opportunity, John sprinted toward it, his legs burning with effort. Reaching the machine, he examined it closely. True to his earlier observation, there was indeed a manual override switch tucked beneath a panel on its side. With no time to waste, John pried open the compartment and began dismantling the internal circuitry. His fingers moved swiftly, guided by years of practice. One wrong move could trigger the explosives hidden inside, but John pushed aside his fear. Failure wasn't an option. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he disconnected the last wire. The drone sputtered and fell to the ground, harmless. Breathing heavily, John slumped against a tree trunk, relief washing over him. But the victory was short-lived. Moments later, another alarm sounded, this time from the opposite side of the estate. "They're coming in waves," Richard said, appearing beside John with a flashlight in hand. "We can't stop them all." John nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we'll have to take the fight to them." Together, they formulated a new strategy. Richard coordinated with his security team to establish a perimeter defense, deploying guards to key locations and setting up barriers to slow down incoming drones. Meanwhile, John focused on enhancing the jamming device, increasing its range and power output. He also rigged several traps using materials found in the mansion's workshop, homemade tripwires and decoy transmitters designed to confuse the attackers. As dawn approached, the battle intensified. Wave after wave of drones descended upon the estate. each one more sophisticated than the last. Some carried explosives, while others were equipped with hacking tools intended to disable the mansion's security systems. Despite the odds, John and Richard held their ground, working seamlessly as a team. Whenever a drone breached the perimeter, John neutralized it with his modified jammer or improvised gadgets, while Richard ensured the rest of the team stayed, organized and alert. At one point, John narrowly avoided disaster when a drone exploded mere feet away from him, sending shards of metal flying in all directions. Covered in dirt and debris, he staggered to his feet, shaken but unharmed. Richard ran to his side, concern etched on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked urgently. John brushed himself off and gave a weary smile. "I've been through worse," he quipped, though his voice betrayed his exhaustion. "Let's finish this." By sunrise, the worst of the attack had passed. Dozens of drones lay scattered across the property, their engines silent and circuits fried. Exhausted but victorious, the team regrouped in the control room to assess the damage. Though the estate had suffered minor structural damage and some equipment was destroyed, no lives had been lost. Thanks to John's ingenuity and Richard's leadership, they had managed to repel the assault. As the adrenaline faded, John sank into a chair, his body aching from hours of non-stop work. Richard handed him a bottle of water, gratitude shining in his eyes. "You saved us," he said simply. "I don't know how to thank you." John shrugged, taking a sip of water. "Just doing my part," he replied modestly. "Besides, I couldn't have done it without your team." Richard smiled, shaking his head. "Still, you're a hero. Don't ever forget that." For the first time in days, John allowed himself to relax. The danger wasn't completely gone. The mastermind behind the attack remained at large. But for now, they were safe. And though he had started this journey as just a retired electrician answering a mistaken phone call, John realized he had become something more. A protector, a problem solver, and perhaps a friend. But as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting golden light over the battered estate, John couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal was far from over. Somewhere out there, someone was still watching, waiting, and plotting. And when the next challenge arrived, John knew he would be ready to stand alongside Richard and face whatever came their way. The aftermath of the drone attack left everyone at Richard Harrison's estate physically and emotionally drained. The once pristine property now bore the scars of battle, burnt patches of grass, shattered windows, and twisted metal debris scattered across the grounds. Yet, amidst the destruction, a sense of victory lingered in the air. Against all odds, they had survived an assault that could have ended in tragedy, and much of that triumph was owed to John Miller, the unassuming retired electrician whose quick thinking and steady hands had turned the tide. As the cleanup began, Richard took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. He had always prided himself on being self-reliant, a man who built his empire through sheer determination and intelligence. But this experience had taught him something new. Even the strongest people needed help sometimes. Without John's unique perspective and practical skills, Richard might not have made it through the night. It was humbling and oddly comforting to realize that greatness didn't come from standing alone, but from trusting others and working together. Richard approached John, who was sitting on the porch steps nursing a cup of coffee. His clothes were smudged with grease and dirt, and there were dark circles under his eyes, but he looked content. For John, the adrenaline rush of the past few days had faded, leaving behind a quiet satisfaction. He had done what he set out to help someone in need, and that was enough for him. "John," Richard said, pulling up a chair beside him, "I owe you more than I can ever repay." John chuckled softly, waving off the comment. "You don't owe me anything, Richard. I just did what anyone else would have done." "That's where you're wrong," Richard replied earnestly. "Not everyone would step into danger like you did. You risked your life for strangers, for me. That takes courage, and I'll never forget it." For a moment, neither man spoke. The morning sun cast long shadows over the yard, and the distant chirping of birds provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation. Finally, Richard broke the silence. Tell me, what made you decide to get involved? You barely knew me when you first called." John thought about the question before answering. "I guess it comes down to one thing," he said slowly. "When I traced that number to your company, I realized it wasn't just a random misdial. Something about it felt important. Like maybe fate had put me in the right place at the right time. And honestly, I couldn't live with myself if I ignored it and something bad happened." Richard nodded, understanding exactly what John meant. In a world full of noise and distractions, it was rare to find someone who listened to their instincts and acted on them without hesitation. John's actions weren't driven by greed or glory. They came from a genuine desire to make a difference. It was a quality Richard admired deeply. Over the next few days, Richard insisted that John stay at the mansion while repairs were underway. Though John initially protested, citing his modest lifestyle and lack of familiarity with luxury, he eventually agreed. After all, the estate still required constant monitoring, and John's expertise remained invaluable. Besides, Richard enjoyed having him around. Their conversations ranged from technical discussions about wiring systems to philosophical musings about life, purpose, and legacy. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, they found common ground in their shared values of hard work, integrity, and compassion. During this time, Richard also worked closely with law enforcement agencies to track down the mastermind behind the attacks. Evidence collected from the disabled drones led investigators to a shadowy organization specializing in cyber warfare and corporate espionage. The group operated globally, targeting high-profile individuals and companies to destabilize industries and seize power. Richard's prominence in the tech world had made him a prime target, but thanks to John's intervention, their plan had been thwarted, for now. Though relieved, Richard knew the threat wasn't entirely gone. As long as the organization existed, he and those close to him would remain vulnerable. Determined to protect his family, employees, and assets, Richard invested heavily in upgrading his security infrastructure. He hired additional personnel, installed state-of-the-art surveillance systems, and implemented protocols designed to detect and neutralize future threats. But more importantly, he kept John on retainer, not as a formal employee, but as a trusted advisor whose insights continued to prove indispensable. News of the thwarted attack spread quickly, though details were kept deliberately vague to avoid alarming the public. Journalists clamored for interviews, eager to uncover the truth behind the mysterious events at Richard Harrison's estate. Richard handled the media carefully, deflecting questions about how the crisis was resolved. Instead, he focused on praising his team's efforts and acknowledging the bravery of those who had stood by him during the darkest hours. One evening, as Richard scrolled through online articles about the incident, he stumbled upon a post written by a local journalist. The piece highlighted John's role in saving Richard's life, describing him as an unlikely hero whose humility and resourcefulness had saved the day. The article included quotes from neighbors and friends, painting a vivid picture of John as a kind, dependable man who always put others first. By the end of the week, John's story had gone viral, earning him widespread admiration and respect. At first, John was uncomfortable with the attention. He had never sought recognition or fame, preferring to live a quiet, low-key life. But as messages poured in from strangers thanking him for inspiring hope and reminding them of the power of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things, John began to see the impact of his actions. People saw him not as a retired electrician, but as proof that anyone, regardless of age or status, could rise to the occasion when it mattered most. Richard noticed the change in John almost immediately. There was a newfound confidence in his step, a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Encouraged by this transformation, Richard invited John to join him at a charity gala honoring humanitarian efforts in technology. Initially hesitant, John agreed after some persuasion, realizing it was an opportunity to share his story and inspire others. The gala was held in a grand ballroom adorned with glittering chandeliers and elegant decorations. Guests dressed in formal attire mingled freely, exchanging pleasantries and discussing innovative projects aimed at improving lives worldwide. When Richard introduced John to the crowd, the room erupted in applause. Standing beside Richard, John, felt a mix of pride and gratitude. For so many years he had believed his best days were behind him. Now he understood that every stage of life brought its own opportunities to grow, learn, and contribute. In his speech, John spoke candidly about his journey, from receiving the mistaken phone call to dismantling explosive drones in the dead of night. He emphasized the importance of listening to one's instincts, helping others without expecting rewards, and embracing challenges with courage and humility. His words resonated deeply with the audience, earning him a standing ovation. By the time the gala ended, John's perspective on life had shifted dramatically. He returned home to his cozy house and beloved garden, but he carried with him the knowledge that his actions had touched countless lives. Though he resumed his usual routine, fixing appliances and tending to plants, he did so with renewed purpose. He started volunteering at community centers, teaching young people basic electrical skills and encouraging them to pursue careers in STEM fields. He also partnered with Richard to launch a scholarship program for aspiring engineers and technicians, ensuring that future generations had access to education and resources. As for Richard, he continued to thrive in the tech industry, using his influence to advocate for stronger cybersecurity measures and ethical practices. But more importantly, he cherished the friendship he had formed with John. They remained in touch, meeting regularly to discuss ideas, solve problems, and simply enjoy each other's company. Their bond served as a reminder that true connections transcend differences in wealth, status, or background. Years later, when asked about the events that had changed his life forever, John smiled and shrugged. It was just a mistake, he'd say, referring to the misdial that had brought him and Richard together. But sometimes mistakes lead to the greatest adventures, and indeed for both men, that single phone call had sparked a chain reaction of courage, collaboration, and camaraderie, a testament to the idea that even the smallest actions can have profound consequences. Through their shared experiences, they had proven that heroes aren't defined by capes or titles, but by the choices they make and the lives they touch.